here today David Goldberger, who was a general counsel of the ACLU of Ohio from 1984 to 1993. We are interviewing him as part of our ACLU of Ohio Oral History Project to better document our organization's significant litigation history. Your interviewer today is Colleen Benoit, History Associate. On this day, July 11, 2009, 1 o'clock p.m. in Columbus, Ohio, ACLU office. David, thank you for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
Well, we're going to start with just a few background questions to get to know you a little better, figure out how you came into the significant position that you did. So where were you born and in what year?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois, 1941.
Please describe your childhood for us.
My father was a businessman. My mother was a stay-at-home mother. My mother, I would say, was fairly apolitical. My father was a liberal, but who was deeply concerned about the basic rights of others, and it was something that was part of the family discussion all during my younger years. Fairness, fairness, fairness.
Did you have any siblings?
I had two sisters, one older and one younger. Have two siblings, one older and one younger.
Where did you attend college?
I spent my freshman year in college, I was at the University of Illinois, and then my sophomore, junior, and senior year, I went to the University of Chicago. I spent a year in graduate school at Columbia University working on a master's, but it was a 2-year program, and after the first year, it was in international affairs. I said, this is not really where it's at for me, and I came back to law school at the University of Chicago.
Can you talk to us a little bit about your decision to attend law school?
Well, I was reluctant because my father wanted me to go to law school. So I kept saying, I don't know. But when I started about the end of my first semester in graduate school, I said, wait a second, I want to do something. I just don't want to read about it. And law school was the obvious choice at that point. And I said, there's an opportunity if I'm a lawyer to make a difference, and that was the final decision.
You began your working as the legal and legislative director for the ACLU of Illinois the same year you graduated law school in 1967. How did you come into this job?
Well, let me kind of tweak that background. I started fresh out of law school, but I was a staff attorney or staff counsel for a couple of years, and I think I started at $6,000 a year in Chicago. And money, a dollar was worth a lot more than it is today, but it was still a pretty basic salary. And about 2 or 3 years in, the legal director left, and they asked me to become legal director, and I did.
You talked a bit about your father and his insistence on fairness. Is there anything else in your life that really led you to discover preserving civil liberties was something that you really wanted to do?
Well, it was, I guess, I can't hang a particular experience or any particular training, but when I was active in student government in high school. In my senior year at graduation, I gave a speech, and the speech was basically about the obligation of all of the graduating seniors to make a difference and make the country a better place. And I stayed with that after. I don't know exactly where it came from, except that it was consistent, I think, with the idealism of my father.
So you worked with the ACLU Illinois Division until 1980. Can you tell us when and why you moved to Ohio?
Well, I had a terrific experience and loved the Illinois Division. And following as the Skokie case wound up, I was really in my 11th year of working at the ACLU there, and the 13th year of my being in practice. And I had been teaching night school, basically, at Kent Law School. And I said, I really like this. And so I decided to put myself in what they proverbially call the meat market to see if what kind of a position I could get in teaching. And I got an offer from Ohio State that I couldn't turn down, and I came.
So how did you first get involved with the ACLU of Ohio?
I called them. I was here. I mean, the ACLU is always going to have a special place in my life, and it formed me as a professional, and I love it dearly, even when they make the organization makes policy mistakes that I think it shouldn't, but I'm basically sincerely committed to the organization, so that it was pretty easy to get affiliated and to stay affiliated.
In what capacity did you work for the ACLU of Ohio, and how long did you work in that position?
Well, the information that the interviewers provided is more helpful than my memory. I was on the board and general counsel for 8 or 9 years, 7 years, right in that range during the 90s, and it was a time of transition for the ACLU of Ohio, and it was a fun time to be affiliated with the organization.
Can you talk a little bit about that transition?
Well,
what you're referring to?
it was the ACLU in Ohio had basically two concentrations of activity, one in Columbus and one in Cleveland, and at that point, the Cleveland chapter was incredibly active and healthy, and had even a full-time staff attorney hired, as I recall. And then you had the Columbus office, which was the state office with a small full-time staff. And it was at a time in the organization's history where fundraising in Central Ohio was pretty tough, and I think the people in the community in Cleveland, greater Cleveland area, was a lot more supportive financially, and it struck a lot of us that it was time to consolidate the operation up in Cleveland, which eventually happened.
And what role did you play in that merger, if you played any?
Well, I was an active board member who supported the merger. There were some who felt that geographically you wanted the headquarters of the organization in the center of the state, where it was easy for all the chapters to where all the chapters could easily access. But I'd had experience in Illinois, where the Chicago office, which is in basically the northeastern quadrant of the state, was the power for that affiliate, which is a very successful affiliate. So I knew the geographical location was a lot less important than the underlying support and and the donor base. And so that it was, I'd had experience with an organization that hadn't been geographically located in the center of the state, and I knew it could be done successfully, so I supported it wholeheartedly.
Do you have any guess as to why Cleveland was stronger than Columbus?
I think that Cleveland is a city that is, in a certain sense, it's a far more urban and metropolitan city. It's an old city. It's a Rust Belt city, and so you had a huge percentage of people a huge number of people who really care about civil liberties. And I think in Columbus it's always been a little support has been a little less kind of natural to the community. When I first came here, Columbus itself was pretty conservative politically and regarded the ACLU as kind of an outlier. And now that's shifted through time as Columbus has become much more diverse politically and does not regard the ACLU as the outlier that it once did. But it was natural to put the organization in the place where it had the greatest support.
So you were general counsel for a little short of a decade.
Yeah.
Can you please tell us what you did?
One thing that I did that I'm very pleased with is that I was on the committee that hired Chris Link, who I think has done a slam-bang job for the organization and has put it on a very sound financial footing and is surely and deftly building a statewide organization in a way that it will be stable and it will stay statewide. As general counsel, typically, though, it's not a very colorful position, but a very important one in my view, because general counsel doesn't litigate cases. General counsel is there to work with the staff and with the board on policy issues, and resolving policy disputes, helping and consulting with the staff on legal questions, and generally being a translator, in my view, a translator of legal and policy issues for the board. And it's a fun position, but it takes time and a lot of work.
You're very well known for your work with the Skokie Case. How were you received when you arrived at the ACLU of Ohio?
Very well. Everybody was, the national organization, or nationally, the organization was very supportive of what was done in the Skokie Case. So when I came here, I think people were happy to have someone with basically a veteran civil liberties litigator coming on board, and I joined the board, after I kind of got my feet wet as an academic and got tenure. And then I was more willing to kind of devote my time to pro bono activities, and this was one that an organization that I really cared about. So it was then that I got involved.
I want to talk a little bit about the cases you did work on with the ACLU of Ohio. You have worked on some of the most well-documented cases, including the Mcintyre versus Ohio Elections Commission and Capitol Square Review Board versus Panett, both of which were decided in the Supreme Court in the 90s. But what were some of your more significant, quote-unquote, orphan cases, ones that might not be as well documented?
Well, the ones that come to mind were the Charles B. case, where the state or the government refused to approve, I suppose it was the social service agency, refused to approve an adoption by two gay men of a kid that was going to be back, in an orphanage or a foster kid. If the adoption didn't go through, they'd established themselves, this gay couple had established themselves as sound parents, and had, I think, as I recall, they'd had the boy as a foster child for a while, and were doing a wonderful job with him. And so finally, they got private counsel, but the ACLU jumped in as an amicus because there was not, at that point, the prejudice against gay adoptions, frankly, was intense. And so that the more that could be done, the better. So we came on as an amicus, but I think a very helpful amicus in the case. And ultimately, the Ohio Supreme Court did the right thing and ruled in favor of the adoption. There was another case, the Andrea Moorhead case. It was a case that came first to the legal clinic because I was on the faculty and working in the clinics at Ohio State. And it was a little black girl that a family had her as a foster child and wanted a white couple and wanted to adopt her, and the social service agency connected with the state said, well, they didn't believe in interracial adoptions. And once again, we said, well, wait a second, that's a racial classification, and you can't stop white parents from adopting a black child simply on the grounds of race. There was no evidence that the child wouldn't flourish with that family. And this time we represented them in court, and the fight, as I recall, went into the State Court of Appeals. And ultimately we won, once again, and no surprise to me. And it really was a kind of a classic ACLU case because it was black social workers who were opposing the adoption, social workers who worked for the state, and it was, in my view, a case that was important because you had to educate people of all races as to the importance of keeping race out of family matters and family decisions.
Any others come to mind as being especially significant?
Not at this point. It's been a number of years, and the biggest ones are the ones you've just mentioned. The Ku Klux Klan case, the Panett case, and then the anonymous leafleting case, the Mcintyre case.
Can you talk to us a little bit about what sorts of precedents those cases set?
Well, it's hard to say at this point what kind of a precedent Mcintyre represents, what its long-run impact is. I'm just delighted with the decision, but it was controversial from day one. The issue there was an anti-tax protester, basically, leafleting in Westerville to oppose the passage of a levy that would support the public schools. And she didn't sign. She was a thorn in everybody's side. She was just really a character, and not someone, I would say, whose views I agreed with. I'm a teacher, a retired teacher now, and my wife was at the time a public school teacher, and I don't think I ever voted against a school tax levy. But this lady absolutely did not like the way that the public schools were spending money. My guess is she never met a tax she approved of. But they got so mad at her up in Westerville that they filed a complaint with the Ohio Election Commission because she didn't put her name and address on the leaflet. And the case came to us when it was after it had been lost in the Ohio Supreme Court, and there was a state precedent, I beg your pardon, a Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court precedent, I believe from the 30s or 40s, which was dead on point, Talley versus California. And I said, either, the Ohio Supreme Court has just reversed Talley versus California, or else the Supreme Court's going to have to reverse Talley versus California. We got to take this thing up. And we filed a cert petition, and sure enough, the Supreme Court took it and reversed it 7-2. Now, what will be the impact? We're in a very ambivalent period right now with campaign finance because anonymity has been plaguing campaign finance reform efforts. And some people point to this case as a case that justifies protecting donors, big donors, from having to disclose who they are when they make a donation to a political candidate. And I don't believe the case stands for that. I believe the case stands for the fact that the state can't require us to say controversial things and then tell everybody who we are. The Federalist Papers were anonymous and people who want to pass out anonymous literature, so long as it's not libelous, ought to be able to do it. And the Supreme Court agreed in that case, and I think that when push comes to shove, the Supreme Court will distinguish the handing out of an anonymous leaflet from anonymous campaign donations. But unfortunately, Congress has been timid about requiring disclosure of anonymous campaign donations. As far as the Panett case is concerned, it was the right of the Ku Klux Klan to put up a Ku Klux Klan cross, which was just simply a white Latin cross, on a public forum next to the State House in Columbus, even though a Jewish group was allowed to put up a menorah. And that was a no-brainer as far as Benson, Wellman, and I were concerned. And the two of us worked with local people who in the Columbus or greater Columbus area who wanted to put up the cross. They were Klansmen, there was no question about it, but the cross was going to be a freestanding cross, just like the menorah, which was, I imagine, 50 feet away, was also a freestanding display. And both Benson and I thought it was a slam dunk when we got into it. And Supreme Court granted cert, much to my amazement anyway. I can't speak for Benson. But they granted cert on the question of whether or not allowing a permit granting or permission to display the cross was an establishment of religion and therefore violated the Establishment Clause. And of course we said it can't be because it was a public forum. Anybody could display whatever they wanted to display there, and all we were saying was that you couldn't pick and choose. And the Supreme Court agreed with us with 2 dissents. So that I'm very pleased with the outcome of the case. I think there were some within the ACLU that were nervous about it on Establishment Clause grounds, but I think that what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and at least on the public forum, so I've never had any problem with providing protection for religious organizations seeking to communicate their views in public places.
You certainly have a lot of experience dealing with some controversial groups. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to advocate on behalf of them when your personal beliefs may not match up?
Well, my experience representing the National Socialist Party of America in Skokie was the most dramatic example of that, but there have been others through the Klan we talked about. I also became the advisor at the law school of the Christian Legal Society when the university refused to recognize them on grounds that they would only permit members of their religion or believers in their religious faith to be officers. And the Supreme Court, unfortunately, in my view, ruled the other way in a case out of California. But I felt that they had a free exercise right, or right to freedom of association. And I didn't agree with them. I suspect I was the first Jewish advisor in the history of the organization. The ACLU here deadlocked on that question and never took a position in the litigation. The National took the wrong position in my view. But as I said earlier, I love the organization even when it does the wrong thing. But representing those groups was I always felt that I was always proud because I felt that it was something that was what makes America distinctive, and that it's fair. It's essentially fair that everyone should have their say, no matter who they are, and no matter how obnoxious their views. And there are times, particularly during the Skokie case, when I knew my family was getting criticized. I knew that there were people that would have liked to have done me in, and the criticism was intense. But I was always proud that felt that we were doing the right thing. There were times, a couple of times, when I got worried that maybe the ACLU was taking heat because I was being so stiff-necked about it. But there was never a question from within the organization. There was always a minority who disagreed, but those on the board stayed on the board. I didn't have it. So far as I know, there were very few board members who resigned. They simply dissented when they disagreed, which I thought was healthy. But it was always something that I always felt that better someone who represents those groups not agree with them. I mean, imagine now having a Ku Klux Klan lawyer in front of the court arguing, a Ku Klux Klan member lawyer arguing on behalf of the Klan. It undercuts the credibility of the claims, because the lawyer is not speaking from a position of principle. He's speaking from a position of political commitment. I never had that commitment to those groups. The commitment was to make sure that they had their day and were treated fairly.
You had mentioned previously about disagreeing with the national on certain issues. In general, did the ACLU of Ohio disagree or agree with national?
No, generally I felt that the ACLU of Ohio agreed with national on most issues, but periodically there would be some issues where there was a parting of the ways. It happened in Illinois more dramatically than here, where the staff prepared a brief supporting the right of the Catholic Church not to hire, as I recall, non-Catholics for particular positions. And some members of the national board at the last minute said that, blocked the filing of the brief. If the truth be known, the brief somehow magically found its way to the Illinois office, and I put my name on it and filed it. I think Cleveland has always been terrific in that respect. Not Cleveland, but the state ACLU has been terrific in that respect, of being very, very committed to basic civil liberties principles and understanding the difference between civil liberties protection and simply being a do-gooder.
You had talked a little bit previously about the political climate in Columbus shifting. In general, in Ohio, what kind of reputation did the ACLU have? And I understand it would vary, but...
That's a tough one, because Ohio has been such a divided state that I really feel that many of its critics, for example, the anti-abortion people, have no ability to accept that there is a group out there doing what it thinks is right and standing on principle and respecting that. I think, and in that, when you get into that kind of an area, you get very antagonistic reaction toward the ACLU. But I think that the press is, even, though the press often disagrees with us, at least in Ohio, has always understood that we are guided by basic civil liberties principles. And I think a lot of the public does. I can't be sure how much, in the sense that we're in a very polarized age where conservative Republicans regard liberal Democrats as raging left-wing lunatics, so that it's so polarized that it's hard to assess how the ACLU is regarded. I there are, on occasions, and I just laugh. There are people when they say, "Oh, you're just a bunch of left-wing loonies," and I said, "Well, why did we represent the Nazis?" And occasionally, you'll get the response, "Well, you were just trying to cover up the fact that you were left-wing loonies." But I don't think that perception is widely shared. I think that most people, when the chips are down, you have clients coming from all parts of the political spectrum. Although less so now, because the ACLU has been emulated by the development of organizations that are much more political in their goals on the right.
Thinking back to your time in the 80s and the 90s, what were some of the hot topics, if you will, that were being debated and litigated?
Well, the hottest was always abortion. And Ohio has always been polarized on that issue. So that there's absolutely no question about that. And with the rights of the freedom of speech of the Ku Klux Klan has always been a hot issue here in the state. I think that right now we're getting into voting reform that is very partisan and designed essentially to disenfranchise poor people and minorities that are likely to vote Democratic. And I, for the life of me, can't understand why it's being so widely accepted by the courts for that reason. But Ohio is becoming one of the leaders in those efforts and saying it's really not about disenfranchisement, it's just preventing fraud, but we all know that fraud is non-existent.
I understand that you had worked on several cases where you dealt with First Amendment rights, especially in prisons, if I recall correctly. Can you talk a little bit about this litigation?
Well, that was the most recent. It started in the clinic, and then the ACLU joined it about 4 years ago now, and it was the constitutionality of a federal statute which required state prison officials to accommodate religious exercise of the inmates. It was passed by under the leadership, I think, of John Colson, who is an Ohioan, who was one of Nixon's brain trust and who went to jail following Watergate. When he got to jail, he discovered that fundamentalist Christianity those adherents to fundamentalist Christian groups or religious sects were not allowed to engage in their religious activities on the same basis as mainstream religious organizations. And so when he was released, he got together with a lot of folks who were recognizing the same thing. And they passed a federal statute. I think Senator Kennedy and Orrin Hatch got together to pass the statute called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Well, the state of Ohio regarded at the time the statute which required the accommodation of religion in its prisons to be a violation of the Establishment Clause. And my clients, when I got them through the legal aid clinic at Ohio State, and then later on, and then the ACLU became involved as well, by a group of Asatru inmates who the state believed were connected with basically the Aryan Brotherhood, which is a white racist organization. And there are some members, maybe many members, I can't tell you, of the religion whose views on race did not square with those of the ACLU. But it was clear that they had a right to engage in their religious exercise so long as it didn't violate any law. And the state of Ohio refused to recognize the group. And so it went to the Supreme Court and then came back down, and we now have a consent decree requiring the state to accommodate the Asatru religion, and I think that the consequences are is that it's going to accommodate other non-mainstream religions and quit messing around with religious views. I really was appalled when they kept saying, well, these are a bunch of gangbangers, racist gangbangers who are trying to use this religion as a cover for gang activities. Since the settlement, which is now just over a year, there have been I repeat, no problems with the inmates. The biggest problems have still been the foot dragging by the Department of Corrections on some issues.
So, reflecting on your years with the ACLU of Ohio, what do you feel is your biggest accomplishment?
Well, it's hard to say what my biggest accomplishment here in Ohio has been. I suppose the prisoner rights case, the Klan case, and the Supreme Court cases. It was exciting and hopefully will have some long-term impact in all three areas: the freedom of speech on public forums, the right to be left alone by the state and not disclose your identity if you don't choose to do so on just an ordinary leaflet articulating a particular view about a referendum, not talking about a candidate. And then the right to practice religion in prisons. I think that I'm delighted with those cases and will always feel good about them. And the only other contribution, I suppose, goes to the fact that I feel that I helped the Ohio ACLU do what it does best, and that is to represent people based on their violations of their civil liberties, and that it never became the kind of do-gooder organization that some affiliates have flirted with becoming. And I've always been proud of the Ohio ACLU for that reason.
In 1994, you won the Civil Liberties Award of the American Civil Liberties Union of Foundation of Ohio, that's a mouthful, for service to civil liberties. Can you tell us a little bit about how you earned that and what it meant to you?
Well, most of what I did to earn that, I suppose, is wrapped up in the discussion we've already had about the cases that I've done and the fact that I was for a while active on the board. What it meant to me is it made me proud. I'm proud to be affiliated with the ACLU and proud of what the ACLU does. So that I've never had any regrets, even when, I think the national organization on occasion has done some dumb things, but never had any regrets in being an ACLUer.
So you've had an active career with the ACLU and with teaching. Where does your heart lie? In teaching or
well,
ACLU?
To me, they're one and the same, because I love teaching, and the thing that the ACLU does that I suppose in a certain way is most important is that it teaches people about freedom and liberty and civil liberties. It does that through its cases. It also does that through its communications with the press and its communications with the public. So that I always prided myself and the organization on our ability to communicate why civil liberties are important and why they're not scary, and why representing all sides isn't a scary thing to be doing. And I regard that as teaching. And I think that Chris Link has a gift for it. Benson Woolman, her predecessor, had a gift for it. The organization has a gift for it, because when you really listen to what's being said, usually the explanation isn't strident, it's not table pounding, it's just plain common sense, and I think that's what people understand the best.
Thank you, David, for your time and your memories. It's a great contribution to the ACLU of Ohio Oral History Project. Appreciate your time.
It was fun.